The morning of November 20th, 1943 dawned blood-red over the Pacific, though the Marines of the 2nd Marine Division couldn't yet know that the crimson sky would prove prophetic. Staff Sergeant William Bordelon checked his Thompson submachine gun one final time as the landing craft pitched violently through the coral-studded waters surrounding Betio Island. Around him, 20-year-old Marines clutched their rifles and tried not to vomit as the small boats bucked like wild horses against the reef that protected their objective. Betio was nothing more than a speck of coral and sand, barely 3 miles long and half a mile wide, but it had become the most heavily fortified piece of real estate in the Pacific. Rear Admiral Kenji Shibasaki, the Japanese commander, had boasted that 1,000,000 men cannot take Tarawa in 100 years. His confidence wasn't misplaced. Over the past year, 4,700 Japanese troops had transformed this tropical paradise into a concrete hell, honeycombed with pillboxes, bunkers, and gun emplacements that could withstand direct hits from battleship shells. The American pre-invasion bombardment had been the most intensive in Pacific War history. Up to that point, for 3 hours, battleships Maryland and Colorado had pounded the tiny island with 16-inch shells, each one weighing as much as a small automobile. Cruisers and destroyers added their thunder to the symphony of destruction, while carrier-based aircraft dropped tons of bombs and napalm. The noise was so overwhelming that Marines 3 miles away had to shout to be heard. Colonel David Shoup, commanding the 2nd Marines, watched the fireworks from his command vessel and felt a mixture of satisfaction and unease. The island appeared to be completely shrouded in smoke and dust, with explosions erupting every few seconds like a man-made volcano. Surely nothing could survive such punishment. Yet intelligence reports suggested the Japanese had prepared for exactly this kind of assault, building their fortifications deep underground and connecting them with tunnels that could shelter thousands of defenders. As the barrage lifted and the first wave of landing craft approached the reef, an ominous silence fell over Betio. The Marines could see palm trees stripped bare of fronds, concrete structures with chunks blown away, and craters filled with seawater dotting the landscape. But they also noticed something troubling. Many of the Japanese positions appeared intact, and there was no movement whatsoever from the defenders. It was as if the island itself was holding its breath, waiting for the right moment to exhale death. The landing craft carrying companies F and G of the 2nd Battalion, 2nd Marines, were the first to discover the cruel reality of Tarawa's defenses. At exactly 9:10 in the morning, as their boats ground against the coral reef still 500 yards from shore, the island erupted. Machine guns that had been silent during the bombardment suddenly chattered to life. From concealed positions, mortars began dropping shells with deadly precision among the stalled landing craft. Artillery pieces that had survived the naval barrage opened fire, sending geysers of water and metal fragments skyward. According to the official Marine Corps' history, the initial assault waves immediately faced withering fire from positions that had weathered the unprecedented bombardment. Private First Class Donald Lillibridge watched in horror as the boat next to his disintegrated under a direct hit from a Japanese 7.5mm gun. Men who had been joking nervously just moments before vanished in a cloud of smoke and spray. The coxswain of his own boat screamed over the din that they were stuck fast on the reef and would have to wade ashore. Looking over the side into the crystal-clear water, Lillibridge could see the coral bottom for feet below and realized with sickening clarity that they would be walking targets for nearly 600 yards. The Marines had trained extensively for amphibious warfare, but nothing had prepared them for this. The reef that protected Betio from natural erosion now served as the perfect killing ground for its Japanese defenders. As the 1st Marines dropped over the sides of their landing craft into the warm Pacific water, they found themselves moving at a slow shuffle through chest-deep water, weighed down by heavy packs and ammunition, while enemy bullets whined overhead like angry hornets. Colonel David Shoup, watching the carnage unfold from his command post, realized that everything they thought they knew about amphibious warfare was being rewritten in blood. The landing craft that were supposed to carry subsequent waves to the beach were either destroyed, damaged, or unable to navigate the coral reef at low tide. This meant that reinforcements and supplies would have to make the same deadly wade through the lagoon as the initial assault troops. Companies F, G, and I of the 2nd Battalion, 2nd Marines, were spread across the reef like scattered toys, with small groups of men taking whatever cover they could find behind coral heads or the wreckage of landing craft. Radio communication was nearly impossible due to water damage and the overwhelming noise of battle. Individual Marines found themselves making life-or-death decisions without any connection to higher command, relying on their training and the leadership of sergeants and corporals who had survived the initial onslaught. The Japanese defenders, meanwhile, were fighting according to a carefully prepared plan. They had studied American amphibious tactics at Guadalcanal and other Pacific battles, learning to hold their fire during pre-invasion bombardments to preserve their weapons and personnel. Their interconnected system of bunkers and tunnels allowed them to shift positions rapidly, appearing to fire from one location before disappearing and emerging elsewhere. Many of their heaviest weapons had been positioned in reverse slope positions, invisible to naval observers, but perfectly sighted to rake the reef and beach approaches. Private First Class Robert Sherritt, a war correspondent who had volunteered to accompany the assault troops, later wrote that the scene on the reef resembled a shooting gallery, except we were the targets. Marines who made it to within 100 yards of the beach found themselves pinned down in the shallow water, unable to advance or retreat. The wounded cried out for corpsmen who were themselves targets the moment they tried to help. Equipment floated everywhere: rifles, packs, ammunition boxes, and personal items scattered across the lagoon like the detritus of a shattered civilization. By noon, it became clear that the initial assault was failing catastrophically. Of the approximately 1,500 Marines who had attempted the landing in the first 3 waves, fewer than 400 had reached the beach, and many of those were wounded or low on ammunition. The rest were either casualties or pinned down on the reef, unable to move forward or backward without exposing themselves to murderous fire from concealed Japanese positions. Major Michael Ryan, commanding the 3rd Battalion, 2nd Marines, received orders to land his reserves on the western edge of Betio, hoping to find a less heavily defended approach. But as his landing craft approached what would later be designated Red Beach 2, they encountered the same deadly reception that had decimated the earlier waves. Japanese gunners had pre-registered their artillery on every possible landing site, and they shifted their fire with mechanical precision from one target to another. The Marines who did manage to reach the beach found that their ordeal was just beginning. The Japanese had constructed a seawall of coral and concrete that ran along the entire northern shore of Betio, creating a perfect defensive position that allowed them to fire down on any Americans who made it ashore. Behind this barrier lay a maze of interconnected bunkers, each one capable of housing dozens of defenders and equipped with multiple firing ports that allowed interlocking fields of fire across the entire beach. Staff Sergeant William Bordelon, despite being wounded multiple times during his wade to shore, continued to attack Japanese positions with his flamethrower and grenades. His actions allowed several squads of Marines to advance beyond the seawall, but the cost was enormous. Every yard of ground gained required individual acts of heroism, and heroes were dying faster than they could be replaced. The carefully orchestrated battle plan that had looked so promising in the briefing rooms back in Hawaii was dissolving into a series of desperate small unit actions fought by exhausted men with dwindling ammunition supplies. As the sun reached its zenith over Betio on November 20th, the full horror of the Battle of Tarawa became apparent to both attackers and defenders. Major Jim Crow, executive officer of the 2nd Battalion, 2nd Marines, had established a precarious command post just beyond the seawall, where he could observe the continuing slaughter. On the reef, while trying to coordinate the scattered groups of Marines who had made it ashore, his radio operator, Corporal Thomas Coulter, lay dead beside him, killed by a sniper's bullet while attempting to establish communication with the command ship offshore. The Japanese defensive plan was proving devastatingly effective. Their commander, Rear Admiral Kenji Shibasaki, had positioned his strongest defenses to cover the most obvious landing beaches while keeping mobile reserves in the center of the island ready to counterattack any penetration. The interconnected bunker system allowed defenders to retreat from one position when it became untenable, only to pop up in another location and continue fighting. Many of the concrete emplacements had been built using steel from dismantled ships, making them virtually impregnable to anything short of direct hits from the heaviest naval guns. Colonel David Shoup, who had finally made it ashore despite being wounded during his wade through the reef, found himself commanding a battle that bore no resemblance to the carefully planned operation he had briefed just days before. Instead of organized companies and battalions advancing according to schedule, he had scattered groups of Marines clinging to whatever cover they could find, many of them running low on ammunition and water. The medical situation was becoming critical, with wounded men lying exposed on the beach because any attempt to evacuate them drew immediate fire from Japanese snipers. Private First Class Ginseng, a 19-year-old from Iowa, found himself alone in a shell crater 50 yards from the seawall, surrounded by the bodies of his squad mates. His rifle had been damaged during the landing, leaving him with only a .40-5 caliber pistol and a fragmentation grenades. Japanese voices echoed from bunkers on all sides, and he could hear the distinctive sound of enemy soldiers moving through the tunnels. Beneath his position, the tropical sun beat down mercilessly, and the smell of curdite mixed with the stench of death and the sickly sweet odor of flowering plants that somehow continued to bloom amid the devastation. The second day of the battle brought fresh horrors. As both sides settled into a grinding war of attrition, American reinforcements continued to arrive, but they faced the same deadly journey across the reef that had claimed so many casualties the day before. The 3rd Battalion, 8th Marines, under Lieutenant Colonel Albert Gilman, made their approach at dawn, hoping that darkness might provide some protection. Instead, they found that Japanese gunners had spent the night precisely registering their weapons on every possible approach route, and the pre-dawn darkness was regularly split by the flash of exploding shells and the tracery of machine gun fire. Sergeant Norman Hatch, a combat photographer who had volunteered to document the battle, captured images that would shock the American public when they were finally released months later. His photographs showed Marines crouched behind the bodies of their fallen comrades, using corpses as sandbags while they tried to locate and eliminate Japanese firing positions. Other images revealed the incredible density of defensive works the Japanese had constructed, concrete bunkers every few yards connected by trenches and tunnels, with firing ports angled to create interlocking fields of fire that made any movement across open ground nearly suicidal. By the afternoon of November 21st, small groups of Marines had managed to penetrate several hundred yards inland, but their advance had been measured in yards rather than miles, and each yard had cost blood. Lieutenant William Dean Hawkins, commanding the Scout Sniper Platoon, had been killed while leading an assault on a Japanese machine gun nest, but not before his men had eliminated 3 major defensive positions that had been holding up the entire advance. His death exemplified the kind of individual sacrifice that was being repeated dozens of times across the tiny battlefield. The Japanese defenders were also paying a terrible price for their resistance. Cut off from resupply and surrounded by an ever-tightening ring of American forces, they fought with the desperation of men who knew they would not leave the island alive. Many of the bunkers that had seemed impregnable the first day were now smoking ruins, their occupants killed by flamethrowers, satchel charges, or point-blank gunfire from Marines who had crawled close enough to drop grenades through firing ports. Yet for every position eliminated, another seemed to take its place, as Japanese reserves moved through their tunnel system to occupy new defensive points. The official Navy historical account notes that by the evening of November 21st, American forces controlled approximately half of Betio, but at a cost that was shocking even by Pacific War standards. The 3rd morning of the Battle of Tarawa dawned with the acrid smell of curdite and death hanging over Betio like a funeral shroud. Private First Class Robert Owens had spent the night huddled in a shell crater with 2 other Marines, listening to Japanese soldiers talking in low voices just yards away. His water had run out the previous afternoon, and his lips were cracked and bleeding from the combination of salt spray and tropical heat. Around him lay the evidence of 2 days of the most intense fighting in Marine Corps' history: shattered weapons, abandoned equipment, and the bodies of men who would never see home again. Colonel David Shoup, his arm in a makeshift sling from a shrapnel wound, established his command post in a captured Japanese bunker near the center of the island. From this position, he could see both the progress his Marines were making and the terrible cost of that progress. Companies that had landed at full strength now numbered fewer than 30 men. The 2nd Battalion, 2nd Marines, which had spearheaded the initial assault, was down to less than 200 effective fighters from an original strength of 900. Yet somehow, through individual acts of extraordinary courage, they were winning. Staff Sergeant William Bordelon, despite having been wounded for times, continued to lead attacks on Japanese positions throughout the 3rd day. His flamethrower had become the most feared weapon on the battlefield, capable of reaching into bunkers that were immune to rifle fire and grenades. By using it effectively required getting within 20 yards of enemy positions, making him a priority target for every Japanese soldier who could draw a bead on him. His Marines watched in awe as he methodically worked his way from one strong point to another, leaving smoking ruins in his wake. The Japanese defenders were beginning to show signs of the strain as well. Many of their best positions had been overrun, and their ammunition supplies were running low. Rear Admiral Kenji Shibasaki, the commander who had boasted that Tarawa could not be taken, was killed during an American artillery barrage on the 2nd day, leaving his subordinates to coordinate an increasingly desperate defense. Without central command, individual Japanese units began fighting in isolation, making last stands in whatever positions they could hold rather than attempting coordinated counterattacks. Major Michael Ryan, whose 3rd Battalion had finally established a secure foothold on the western end of Betio, organized a series of coordinated attacks designed to roll up the Japanese defensive line from the flank. His Marines had learned hard lessons about fighting in this environment. Bunkers that appeared destroyed from one angle might still contain active defenders who could emerge from hidden exits. Wounded Japanese soldiers often fought to the death rather than surrender, and every cave or tunnel had to be cleared individually, usually by Marines crawling forward with grenades or flamethrowers. The most decorated action of the entire battle occurred when 2nd Lieutenant Alexander Bonnyman Jr. led an assault on a massive Japanese bunker complex that dominated the center of the island. This position, built around a large ammunition dump, had withstood 2 days of bombardment and had been responsible for hundreds of American casualties. Bonnyman, a 33-year-old engineer from Kentucky, organized a desperate charge up the sides of the bunker, fighting hand-to-hand with Japanese defenders who emerged from concealed positions. Though he was killed during the assault, his sacrifice allowed his Marines to capture the position and turn its weapons against other Japanese strong points. By midday on November 22nd, organized Japanese resistance was beginning to collapse, but individual positions continued to fight with fanatic determination. Corpsman John Bradley, who would later become famous for his actions at Iwo Jima, repeatedly exposed himself to enemy fire while treating wounded Marines. His medical bag had been shot through multiple times, but he continued to crawl from one casualty to another, often under direct observation by Japanese snipers, who seemed to take particular pleasure in targeting medical personnel. The final phase of the battle became a grim process of bunker-by-bunker clearing that required individual Marines to demonstrate courage that would have seemed impossible just days before. Private First Class Robert Sherritt, the war correspondent, wrote that he witnessed acts of heroism so common that they ceased to seem remarkable. Marines throwing themselves on grenades to save their comrades, wounded men refusing evacuation to continue fighting, and small groups of soldiers attacking fortified positions that should have required entire companies to reduce. Sergeant Norman had continued documenting the battle even as Japanese shells exploded around him, creating a photographic record that would serve as testimony to both American valor and the horrific cost of amphibious warfare. His images showed Marines who had aged years in just days, their faces blackened with curdite and etched with exhaustion, while still advancing toward the next objective. Other photographs captured the incredible destruction that modern weapons could inflict on a small piece of real estate. Concrete bunkers reduced to rubble, palm trees stripped to bare poles, and the very landscape transformed into a moonscape of craters and debris. The 4th day of the Battle of Tarawa began with an eerie quiet that unnerved the Marines, more than the constant gunfire of the previous days. Lieutenant Colonel Raymond Murray, commanding the 2nd Battalion, 6th Marines, had arrived as reinforcement during the night, and his fresh troops provided the final push needed to eliminate the remaining pockets of Japanese resistance. But as his men advanced through areas that had been contested just hours before, they discovered the true cost of their victory written in the bodies of friends and enemies scattered across every yard of Betio's coral soil. Colonel David Shoup, now wearing a Purple Heart ribbon alongside his other decorations, walked slowly through the devastated airstrip that had been the primary objective of the entire operation. The runway was cratered and unusable, littered with the wreckage of Japanese aircraft and the abandoned equipment of both sides. More disturbing were the human remains, Japanese soldiers who had died at their posts, American Marines who had fallen within sight of their objective, and the grotesque tableau of modern warfare played out on a stage smaller than most city blocks. Private First Class Eugene Sledge, who had survived the entire battle despite being wounded twice, sat on what remained of a palm tree and tried to process what he had experienced. Around him, Marines were beginning the grim task of collecting dog tags from American dead and searching bunkers for any Japanese soldiers who might still be alive and dangerous. The smell of death was overwhelming, a mixture of decaying flesh, curdite, and the sweet tropical flowers that somehow continued to bloom amid the devastation. Many of the surviving Marines had developed a 1,000-yard stare, their eyes focused on something beyond the immediate horror surrounding them. The casualty figures were staggering even by Pacific War standards. Of the approximately 4,700 American Marines who had participated in the assault, Over 1,000 had been killed and more than 2,000 wounded in just 7 to 6 hours of fighting. Many units had been reduced to a handful of effective fighters. The 2nd Battalion, 2nd Marines, which had led the initial assault, counted fewer than 150 men present for duty out of an original strength of 900. Company F, which had been in the first wave to hit the beach, had exactly 7 men left unwounded. The Japanese defenders had fought with a tenacity that impressed even their enemies. Of the original garrison of 400 to 700 men, fewer than 20 had been taken alive, and most of those were unconscious or dying from wounds. The rest had died at their posts or in the final suicidal charges that marked the end of organized resistance. Rear Admiral Kenji Shibasaki's boast that 1,000,000 men cannot take Tarawa in 100 years had proven tragically incorrect, but his soldiers had made the Americans pay a price that shocked military planners and the public back home. Staff Sergeant William Bordelon, who had been wounded 7 times during the battle but refused evacuation, finally collapsed while helping to clear a Japanese bunker. On the afternoon of November 23rd, his fellow Marines carried him to the aid station, where Navy corpsmen worked frantically to save his life, but his injuries were too severe. He died holding the hand of a fellow Marine. His last words a request to make sure his mother received the medal he had earned. His actions during the battle would later earn him the Medal of Honor, but the recognition seemed hollow compared to the loss of a man who had embodied the Marine Corps' values of courage, honor, and sacrifice. According to contemporary reports in Stars and Stripes, the military newspaper, the casualty rates at Tarawa were unprecedented in American amphibious warfare experience. The immediate aftermath of the battle revealed both the strategic importance of the victory and the tactical lessons that would reshape American amphibious doctrine. The airstrip that had cost so many lives to capture would indeed prove valuable for supporting future operations in the Marshall Islands, exactly as military planners had predicted. But the techniques used at Tarawa, particularly the assumption that naval bombardment could suppress all defensive positions, would be completely revised. Based on the hard-learned lessons of Bedio, Major General Julian Smith, commanding the 2nd Marine Division, walked among his exhausted troops and tried to find words that could somehow acknowledge their sacrifice while justifying the cost. Many of the men avoided his gaze, not from disrespect, but from the emotional numbness that follows extreme trauma. They had accomplished their mission and proven that American forces could take even the most heavily fortified positions, but the price had been almost too high to bear. The victory at Tarawa was complete and strategically important, yet it left survivors questioning whether any piece of real estate was worth such carnage. The morning of November 24th brought a different kind of horror to the survivors of Tarawa. As burial details began the massive task of interring the dead, Chaplain Wyeth Willard, whose voice had grown hoarse from conducting field services throughout the battle, now faced the overwhelming task of providing dignity and closure for hundreds of Marines who would never return home. The coral soil of Bedio, so hard that Japanese defenders had needed dynamite and pneumatic drills to dig their bunkers, now yielded reluctantly to American shovels, creating temporary graves for boys who had become men and died as heroes in the space of 4 days. Colonel David Shoup, promoted to brigadier general effective immediately upon the completion of the battle, established his final command post in what had been Rear Admiral Kenji Shibasaki's headquarters. The Japanese commander's body had been found in the rubble of a concrete bunker, killed by American artillery fire on the 2nd day of fighting. His maps and defensive plans, recovered intact, revealed the sophisticated nature of the fortifications that had cost so many American lives. Every beach approach, every possible landing site, every route of advance had been carefully surveyed and prepared as a killing ground. The strategic implications of the victory at Tarawa were immediately apparent to military planners throughout the Pacific. The captured airfield, once repaired, would provide crucial support for future operations against the Marshall Islands and ultimately the Japanese home islands. The lessons learned about amphibious warfare against heavily fortified positions would inform every subsequent landing from Saipan to Okinawa, but these strategic benefits seemed abstract and distant to the Marines, who had paid for them with their blood and the lives of their friends. Private First Class Robert Sherrod, the war correspondent who had accompanied the assault troops, began filing dispatches that would shock the American public when they were finally cleared by military censors. His vivid descriptions of Marines wading through chest-deep water under murderous fire, of young men dying within sight of objectives they would never reach, of the incredible courage displayed by ordinary Americans pushed beyond the limits of human endurance, would help the nation understand both the reality of Pacific warfare and the price being paid for ultimate victory. The medical statistics from Tarawa revealed the intensity of the fighting in ways that cold casualty figures could not convey. Navy corpsmen had treated over 3,000 casualties in less than 4 days, working in conditions that ranged from difficult to impossible. Many of the wounded had been hit multiple times, testament to the accuracy of Japanese defensive fire and the inability of assault troops to find adequate cover during their advance. The percentage of head and chest wounds was unusually high, indicating that enemy gunners were skilled marksmen rather than desperate amateurs. Second Lieutenant Alexander Bonnyman Jr., who had died leading the assault on the central Japanese strongpoint, was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor for his sacrifice. His widow would receive the medal at a ceremony in Washington, but no ceremony could compensate for the loss of a husband and father who had given everything for his country. His story was repeated dozens of times across the small battlefield of Betio, where individual acts of extraordinary courage had been the only thing standing between American forces and complete disaster. The Japanese defenders, despite their defeat, had demonstrated the effectiveness of defense in depth against amphibious assault. Their use of interconnected bunkers, pre-registered artillery fire, and disciplined fire control during the pre-invasion bombardment would be copied by Japanese forces throughout the Pacific. The lesson they taught at Tarawa, that heavily fortified positions could extract a terrible price, even from a victorious enemy, would be repeated with even deadlier effect at places like Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Corpsman John Bradley, who had repeatedly exposed himself to enemy fire while treating wounded Marines, found himself overwhelmed by the scope of human suffering he had witnessed. Many of the men he had saved would carry physical and emotional scars for the rest of their lives, while others had died despite his best efforts. The randomness of survival in combat, why some men lived while others died, would haunt him for decades, as it would haunt every survivor of the battle. Staff Sergeant William Bordelon's death became symbolic of the sacrifice made by all Marines at Tarawa. His Medal of Honor citation would read in part, "Conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty." But such formal language could never capture the reality of his actions or the loss felt by the men who had served with him. His grave on Betio, marked by a simple wooden cross, would become a shrine for Marines who wanted to honor not just his sacrifice, but that of all the men who had died taking the island. The immediate strategic value of Tarawa was undeniable, but its cost had been almost unbearable. American forces had proven they could take any fortified position, but the price in blood raised serious questions about the sustainability of such tactics. Military planners would spend months analyzing the battle, seeking ways to achieve similar strategic objectives without repeating the horrific casualties that had marked the conquest of Betio. The final reckoning of the Battle of Tarawa came not in the immediate aftermath of victory, but in the months and years that followed as its lessons echoed through every subsequent amphibious operation in the Pacific War. General Holland Smith, commanding all Marine forces in the Central Pacific, arrived on Betio 3 days after the fighting ended and walked silently through the devastated landscape where so many of his Marines had died. The small island, which could be walked from end to end in less than an hour, had become a laboratory for understanding the true cost of modern amphibious warfare. The American public's reaction to the casualty figures from Tarawa was one of shock and dismay. More than 1,000 United States troops had been killed and some 1,000 wounded in only 3 days of fighting, and the American public was stunned by the number of lives lost in taking such a tiny island. Newspaper editorials questioned whether any strategic objective could justify such losses, while families across the nation mourned sons, brothers, and husbands who had died on a coral atoll most Americans had never heard of before November 20th, 1943. Military analysts, however, recognized that Tarawa represented a crucial turning point in Pacific strategy. The techniques developed during the battle, improved naval gunfire control, better coordination between air and ground forces, enhanced medical evacuation procedures, and more effective methods for clearing fortified positions would save thousands of lives in future operations. The bitter lessons learned at such terrible cost on Betio would prove invaluable. When American forces faced similar defensive positions throughout the Central Pacific Offensive, Colonel David Shoup, now Brigadier General Shoup, and wearing the Medal of Honor he had earned for his leadership during the battle, found himself tasked with writing the official after-action report that would guide future amphibious doctrine. His analysis was brutally honest about the failures in planning and execution that had cost so many lives, while also acknowledging the extraordinary courage displayed by individual Marines who had overcome seemingly impossible odds through pure determination and sacrifice. The technological innovations that emerged from Tarawa analysis would revolutionize amphibious warfare, improve landing vehicles that could navigate coral reefs, better communication equipment that could withstand water damage, more effective methods for coordinating naval gunfire support, and enhanced medical evacuation procedures all traced their development back to lessons learned during those bloody days on Bedio. American forces would never again approach a fortified beach with such inadequate preparation, or such naive assumptions about the effectiveness of preliminary bombardment. Private First Class Robert Sherritt's dispatches from Tarawa, when finally released to the public, provided Americans with their first unvarnished look at the reality of Pacific combat. His descriptions of Marines displaying incredible courage under impossible circumstances helped the nation understand that victory in the Pacific would require sacrifices on a scale previously unimaginable. His work also established a new standard for war correspondence, demonstrating that the public could handle the truth about combat if it were presented with proper context and respect for those who served. The graves registration teams that worked for weeks on Bedio to identify and properly bury American dead created detailed records that would eventually allow most families to recover the remains of their loved ones. But many Marines who had died in the water during the initial assault were never found, their bodies claimed by the Pacific that had brought them to war. These missing warriors would be remembered on memorials back home, but their physical remains became part of the coral reef that had been both obstacle and killing ground during the battle. Staff Sergeant William Bordelon's Medal of Honor was presented to his mother in a ceremony at the White House, where President Franklin Roosevelt spoke of the debt all Americans owed to men like her, son who had given everything for their country's cause. But no presidential words could ease the pain of mothers, wives, and children who had lost their heroes at Tarawa. The medal citations and official commendations were important for history, but they were small comfort to families who would spend the rest of their lives with empty chairs at holiday tables. The Japanese military's analysis of their defeat at Tarawa led to important changes in their defensive strategy throughout the Pacific. They recognized that their forces had inflicted disproportionate casualties on American attackers, validating the concept of defense in depth from fortified positions. This lesson would be applied with even deadlier effect at Iwo Jima and Okinawa, where Japanese defenders would extract an even higher price from American forces advancing toward the Japanese home islands. Contemporary military analyses published in professional journals noted that Tarawa had fundamentally changed American understanding of what amphibious warfare would cost. In the Central Pacific Campaign, the Battle of Tarawa had lasted 76 hours from the first landing to the final elimination of organized resistance. In that brief span, it had claimed more American lives per square yard than any other battle in Marine Corps history. Yet it had also demonstrated that American forces could take any position, no matter how heavily fortified, if they were willing to pay the price in blood. The strategic value of that lesson would become apparent in every subsequent Pacific campaign, from the Marshalls to the Philippines to the final assault on Japan itself. The legacy of Tarawa lived on in the men who survived it, carrying physical and emotional scars that would mark them for the rest of their lives. They had participated in one of the most intense battles in military history and had emerged victorious, but victory had come at a price that would haunt them forever. They had proven American courage under the most extreme circumstances, but they had also learned that courage alone was not enough, that future battles would require better planning, better equipment, and better understanding of what it truly meant to assault a fortified position, defended by determined enemies willing to fight to the death.